He had imagined her small. He had pictured a woman with delicate hands, the kind that would tend his garden with a gentle touch. He dreamed of soft words that would fill the deafening silence of his lonely ranch. He had spent months carving this image in his mind, a perfect companion for a quiet life on the frontier. But when the dust from the wagon wheels finally settled, Emmett Sloan found himself staring up, and up, and up. He was staring at a woman who could probably lift him with one arm and the horse he rode in on with the other. This was Willa Blaine. She stood a solid 6 feet tall in her worn-out boots, with shoulders that were broader than most men in town. Her hands, resting on her hips, looked like they could wrestle a plow into submission, not gently handle a teacup. The letter in his pocket, the one he had read 100 times, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. The wedding ring he had painstakingly carved from a piece of solid oak seemed impossibly, comically small. Just 3 months earlier, Emmett had placed his advertisement in the territorial newspaper with hands that trembled from a mixture of hope and fear. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He'd only received one response. Just one. It was written in a careful, elegant script, and it spoke of a loneliness that mirrored his own so perfectly it was like looking into his own soul. Willa's letters had painted vivid pictures for him, pictures of cozy meals shared by candlelight, of quiet conversations that would stretch late into the night. She wrote like someone who truly understood the crushing weight of solitude that pressed down on an isolated homestead. But in all those beautifully written letters, filled with poetic thoughts and gentle promises, never once had she mentioned that she stood taller than his barn door. Fletcher Knox, the town merchant who had arranged the whole meeting, cleared his throat. It was a nervous, scratchy sound. He climbed down from the wagon driver's seat, his eyes darting back and forth between Emmett's stunned, pale face and Willa's imposing figure. He looked like a man trapped between a rock and a mountain. The woman herself, Willa, seemed just as surprised. Her confident, solid posture faltered for just a moment as she took in Emmett's slight frame. She watched the way he had to crane his neck, the way his eyes had to travel up a long way just to meet her gaze. For a long, painful moment, the three of them stood frozen in the dusty yard. They were like actors in a play who had all forgotten their lines at the exact same time. The silence stretched, growing louder and more awkward with every passing second until it was almost unbearable. Emmett could feel the eyes on him. He could feel the curious stares of his neighbors, who had all conveniently found reasons to be outside to witness the arrival of his mail-order bride. He saw Mrs. Henderson from the general store whisper something to her husband behind her hand, her eyes wide with amusement. He saw young Tommy Morrison actually point, his mouth hanging open, before his mother yanked his arm down with a sharp tug. The whole scene felt like a public spectacle, a circus where he was the main, unfortunate attraction. Emmett's cheeks burned with a hot, spreading embarrassment that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Willa finally broke the silence. Her voice was deeper than he had expected. Much deeper. But it wasn't unkind. "You must be Emmett." She extended a hand. When he reluctantly offered his own, hers completely engulfed it. Her grip was firm, powerful, but also careful. It was the grip of someone who was constantly, keenly aware of her own strength and was afraid of breaking things by accident. "I suppose," she said slowly, her eyes scanning his face, "we should talk." The way she said it told him everything. It suggested she was having the exact same tidal wave of doubts that were currently crashing through his own mind. Was this all a terrible mistake? Fletcher Knox, sensing the suffocating tension, quickly busied himself unloading Willa's single trunk from the back of the wagon. It was a large, heavy-looking trunk, bigger than Emmett had anticipated, which only reinforced the growing, sinking realization that nothing, absolutely nothing about this arrangement was going to match his expectations. The merchant's hurried movements, the way he avoided looking at either of them, betrayed his own deep discomfort with the awkward situation he had helped create. But then, as Emmett watched Willa, something unexpected happened. He watched her survey his modest ranch. He saw her eyes scan the simple cabin, the patches in the corral fence, the small stack of firewood by the porch. He braced himself for the flicker of disappointment, the curl of her lip, the sigh of regret. But it never came. She didn't wrinkle her nose. Instead, she nodded. It was a slow, approving nod, directed at his well-tended vegetable garden. Her gaze lingered on it, and for the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. Whatever shock she felt at his appearance, at his size, at his humble life, she was keeping it locked away behind a wall of grace he never would have expected from someone who looked like she could break him in half. But Emmett was wrong. The shock wasn't the biggest thing she was hiding. It wasn't even close. He looked from her powerful hands to the delicate, looping script of the letters in his pocket, and a chilling thought crept into his mind. It was impossible. It couldn't be. But the two just didn't add up. The person who stood before him and the person who wrote those words, they couldn't possibly be the same. The morning after Willa's tense arrival brought a crisis. A full-blown, town-wide disaster that neither of them could have possibly anticipated. Emmett's prize bull, Dakota, had somehow broken through a reinforced fence during the night, and now the massive animal was standing defiantly in the middle of Mrs. Henderson's prized flower garden, 3 properties over. It was a nightmare. The bull was systematically destroying months of his neighbor's careful cultivation. The sound of Mrs. Henderson's furious shouting was a piercing shriek that could be heard clear across the valley. Emmett stood on his porch railing, his hands wringing together, his knuckles white. He watched the catastrophe unfold, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. Dakota weighed nearly 2,000 pounds and had the temperament of a cornered rattlesnake on his best of days. The bull had already charged 2 of the neighbor men who had dared to approach. Emmett had watched them scramble over fences in a panicked, undignified retreat. The situation was spiraling. It was quickly becoming the kind of neighborhood scandal that would follow him for years, a story they'd tell to mock him, the small man who couldn't control his own livestock. "You can't rope him from here," a calm voice observed from beside him. Emmett jumped. It was Willa. She had appeared at his elbow without him even noticing, moving with a surprising quiet for someone her size. Her eyes were fixed on the bull, her expression intense, unreadable. "And those men down there," she continued, her voice low and steady, "are going to get themselves trampled if they keep approaching from the front like that." Emmett just nodded miserably, his throat too tight to speak. "Dakota's always been stubborn, but never like this. I don't know what got into him." The truth was, he had been dreading this exact scenario since the day he bought the bull. He knew deep down that he had neither the physical strength nor the raw experience to handle such a large, powerful animal if it ever truly decided to be uncooperative. And most of his neighbors knew it too, which made the current public humiliation burn even hotter. Without another word, Willa stepped off the porch. She began walking toward the chaos with long, purposeful strides. Emmett, snapping out of his stupor, hurried after her, his shorter legs working double time just to keep up. "Willa, wait!" he called out, his voice thin with panic. "He's dangerous when he's agitated like this. You shouldn't—" But she was already halfway across the field. Her attention was focused, laser-like, entirely on the rampaging bull. She didn't even seem to hear him. As they approached Mrs. Henderson's property, Emmett could see the full extent of the damage. Roses that had taken 3 years to establish were now just trampled, muddy stumps in the dirt. Carefully arranged border stones had been scattered like a child's toys. Mrs. Henderson herself stood on her front steps, her face a blotchy, furious red. She was directing a stream of high-pitched accusations at anyone and everyone within earshot. When she spotted Emmett approaching, her voice rose another octave. "That monster of yours has destroyed everything!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "Look at my garden. Just look at it." You're going to pay for every single plant, Emmett Sloan, and if you can't control your livestock, you have no business keeping them." The other neighbors murmured in agreement, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to openly hostile. Emmett felt his world shrinking. Willa ignored them all. She ignored the shouting, the accusations, the glares. She studied Dakota's movements with the kind of focused, intense attention usually reserved for reading a difficult map. The bull was pawing the ground near what remained of a prize-winning rose bush, his massive head lowered, a clear sign he was preparing for another charge. 2 more men had arrived with ropes, but they stood at a very safe distance, clearly reluctant to get anywhere within range of those wicked-looking horns. Then Willa did something that made Emmett's heart stop cold in his chest. She calmly climbed over the splintered fence. She began walking directly toward the agitated 2,000-pound animal. Her hands were empty. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and impossibly confident. The crowd fell silent. The shouting stopped. Everyone watched, a mixture of fascination and horror on their faces, as this impossibly tall woman approached the beast that had just sent grown men running for their lives. Even Mrs. Henderson stopped her tirade, her mouth hanging open in slack-jawed disbelief. Dakota's massive head swung toward Willa as she approached. His nostrils flared with each heavy, ragged breath. The bull's eyes rolled, showing the whites, a sure sign of an animal pushed beyond reason and into pure, blind rage. Emmett felt his throat constrict. He watched his mail-order bride walk calmly into what looked like certain death. Every instinct screamed at him to call out, to shout, to stop her. But something in her deliberate, calm movements kept him frozen in place, a helpless spectator to the impending disaster. But as Willa got closer, Emmett noticed something strange, something that made no sense. She was whispering, not to herself, but to the bull. And as she spoke, she made a small, subtle gesture with her left hand. It was a quick, almost imperceptible motion near her waist, and across the yard, the bull's raging posture shifted, just a fraction, but it shifted. It was almost as if he had understood her. Willa began speaking to the bull. Her voice was low and steady, a rhythmic, soothing sound that carried just far enough for Emmett to catch fragments. It wasn't the sharp, commanding tone most people used with livestock. No, this was different. Her words flowed like water over stones, a gentle, hypnotic murmur. Dakota's ears, which had been pinned back in aggression, twitched forward. His furious pawing of the ground gradually slowed, then stopped. The crowd of onlookers held their collective breath. They watched as the woman and the beast regarded each other across 10 feet of trampled, ruined garden. "Easy there, big fellow," Willa murmured, extending one hand, palm up, in Dakota's direction. "You're not really angry, are you? Just confused and far from home." She took another slow step closer. Emmett's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The bull could charge at any moment. There was no cover, nowhere for her to run in Mrs. Henderson's enclosed garden. But Dakota didn't charge. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The massive animal's breathing began to even out. His aggressive, lowered head posture relaxed, inch by incremental inch. Willa continued her approach, never breaking eye contact, never hurrying her movements. When she was finally close enough to touch him, she reached out. She placed her hand on his enormous neck, right behind his left ear, in a spot no stranger should ever dare to touch. The effect was immediate and utterly startling. Dakota's head dropped lower. A sound that was almost like a deep, rumbling sigh escaped from his massive chest. Willa began scratching behind his ear with practiced, confident fingers, and the 2,000-pound bull actually leaned into her touch, like an oversized dog seeking affection. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. It was like watching a magic trick. "Someone fetch a lead rope," Willa called over her shoulder. She never took her eyes off Dakota. Her voice carried the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Fletcher Knox, the merchant, scrambled to comply. He returned in a flash with a length of sturdy rope from Emmett's barn. With movements so smooth and efficient they seemed rehearsed, Willa fashioned a simple halter around the bull's massive head. Within minutes, she was leading Dakota out of the ruined garden as docilely as a newborn lamb. The bull followed her without a hint of resistance, his earlier, terrifying aggression completely gone, as if it had never existed. The assembled neighbors parted like the Red Sea before them, their faces a canvas of pure amazement and bewilderment. Mrs. Henderson stood speechless on her porch steps, her prepared speech about livestock control and financial compensation dying unspoken on her lips. As they passed Emmett, Willa caught his eye. She offered him a small, tired smile that transformed her entire face. For the very first time since her arrival, he saw past her intimidating size, past her raw power, to something warmer, something softer underneath. "Your fence has a weak post on the north corner," she said casually, as if taming rampaging bulls was just something she did every morning before breakfast. "We should probably fix that before he decides to take another walk." Emmett could only nod, his mind reeling. He was trying to process what he had just seen. The way she had calmed the beast was beyond skill. It was something else entirely. He thought back to that strange, subtle hand gesture she'd made just before the bull's demeanor changed. It was a signal. He was sure of it. But who or what was she signaling to? And then another, more disturbing thought hit him. He looked at the broken fence post. It wasn't rotted. It wasn't old. It was splintered, shattered, as if it had been broken with incredible force. But the break wasn't from the inside, from where a bull would have pushed out. The splinters were pointing inward. The post had been broken from the outside. Dakota hadn't broken out. Someone had let him out. Word of Willa's incredible feat with the bull spread through the settlement faster than a wildfire in dry grass. By that afternoon, a steady stream of neighbors had found convenient excuses to visit Emmett's ranch. Their curiosity was a palpable thing, barely concealed behind flimsy offers of welcome meals and unsolicited gardening advice. Each visitor cast long, furtive glances at Willa as she worked alongside Emmett to repair the damaged fence. Their whispered conversations created a low, buzzing undercurrent of speculation that made Emmett's skin crawl. The attention reached its peak when Samuel Morrison arrived. He came with his 3 strapping sons in tow, ostensibly to help with the fence work. But it was clear they were more interested in getting a closer look at the woman who had tamed the legendary Dakota with her bare hands. Morrison was the kind of man who measured everything by physical strength and raw power. He was a man who found Emmett lacking in most departments, and he wasn't shy about letting it be known. His very presence always made Emmett feel smaller, weaker than he already was. "Heard your lady friend has a way with livestock," Morrison commented. He leaned against a fence post with a studied, arrogant casualness. His boys arranged themselves behind him like a silent, judging audience, their eyes fixed on Willa. She was driving new fence posts into the hard-packed earth with powerful, rhythmic swings of a heavy sledgehammer. Each blow sent the thick wooden post deeper into the ground than Emmett could have managed with 3 times as many swings. The sight was both impressive and, for Emmett, deeply emasculating. Emmett felt a familiar heat creep up his neck. He knew exactly what Morrison was implying. The man wasn't just commenting on Willa's skill. He was questioning whether Emmett, a man of his slight stature, could possibly provide for and protect a woman of Willa's obvious and, frankly, intimidating capabilities. It was the same dark doubt that had been gnawing at his own confidence since the moment she'd stepped off that wagon. But hearing it voiced by someone like Morrison, hearing the sneer behind the words, made it sting twice as sharp. "Willa grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana," Emmett replied, trying desperately to keep his voice steady and even. "She knows her way around animals." It was true, as far as it went. He had learned this single fact only that morning, when she'd mentioned it, while they were examining Dakota's temperament. Her letters had spoken of wanting a quiet, simple life, but they had never once detailed the kinds of experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of handling a 2,000-pound bull without even breaking a sweat. Morrison's eldest son, a brawny young man of 19, stepped forward. He moved with the kind of unearned confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged by life. "Maybe she'd like some help with that post-hole digger," he offered, his voice carrying the smug assumption that his assistance would be both welcome and necessary. "Looks like heavy work for a—" He trailed off, apparently realizing at the last second that commenting on Willa's gender might not be the wisest move, given what they had all witnessed that morning. Willa looked up from her work. Sweat glistened on her forehead despite the relatively cool temperature. Her expression was polite, but as distant and cold as a winter sky. She considered the young man's offer for a moment. "I appreciate the thought," she said, her voice flat. "But I've got my rhythm now. Might be better if you helped Emmett with stretching the wire." Her tone was perfectly pleasant, but there was an iron core to it, something that discouraged any further offers of assistance. It was a dismissal, plain and simple. The rejection stung the boy's pride. Emmett saw it happen in real time. The boy's shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, and a dull red flush spread across his cheeks. He had just realized that this unusual, powerful woman had absolutely no need for his strength or his protection. Morrison's other sons exchanged quick, confused glances that spoke volumes. The proper social dynamics of this situation were completely alien to them. A woman wasn't supposed to be this capable. A man wasn't supposed to be this unnecessary. Emmett watched the interaction with a growing sense of dread. He could practically see the wheels turning in Samuel Morrison's head. He could see the calculations being made about power, perception, and community standing. Men like Morrison lived by a clear, brutal set of rules about who was strong and who was weak, who led and who followed. Willa's very existence shattered those rules, and it was making people like Morrison deeply, dangerously uncomfortable. But what troubled Emmett most was his own reaction. Part of him felt a surge of pride in Willa's competence, in her fierce independence. But another, darker part of him, a part he was ashamed of, wondered if her strength only served to highlight his own inadequacies. He worried it would make them impossible for anyone, including her, to ignore. As Morrison and his sons finally left, the man gave Emmett a long, lingering look. It was a look of pity mixed with contempt. And then his eyes shifted to the broken fence post from that morning. He ran a hand over the splintered wood, a strange, knowing smirk on his face. And in that moment, Emmett knew. He knew who had broken the fence. He knew who had let the bull out. Morrison had done it. He had manufactured the crisis to humiliate Emmett, to prove him incapable of managing his own ranch, of protecting his own bride. He wanted to show the whole town and Willa herself that Emmett was a weak man who didn't deserve a woman like her. And the most terrifying part? It had almost worked. That evening, as the last of the curious neighbors finally departed, an unnerving quiet settled over the ranch. Emmett found himself alone with Willa for the first time since her chaotic arrival. The silence between them felt heavier and more charged than the humid air that precedes a thunderstorm. They sat on opposite ends of his small porch. The space between them was measured not just in feet, but in the crushing weight of unspoken doubts and wildly mismatched expectations. It was Willa who broke the silence first. Her voice carried a deep weariness that hadn't been there when she was facing down the bull. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She wasn't looking at him as she spoke. Her gaze was fixed on the darkening horizon, where the first stars were beginning to prick the twilight sky. Her profile was strong, angular, nothing like the delicate, gentle features he had spent months imagining. Emmett shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the old wood creaking under his slight weight. I should have been more specific in my letters," he admitted. but even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure what he could have possibly written. By the way, I'm smaller than most men. I sometimes feel lost and overwhelmed on my own ranch. I placed the advertisement not out of confidence, but out of a desperate, suffocating loneliness. About what? Willa turned to face him, her directness catching him completely off guard. About being shorter than average? About having neighbors who measure a man's worth by how much weight he can lift? There was no mockery in her voice, but there was a sharp, painful understanding that made Emmett wonder what kind of life she had lived, what experiences had taught her to recognize such things so quickly and so clearly. The raw honesty in her question demanded an equally honest response. About feeling like I'm not enough, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Not strong enough, not big enough, not man enough for this life I'm trying to build. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and impossible to take back. Willa was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers drummed a slow, thoughtful rhythm against the wooden arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice held a gentleness that surprised him, a softness he hadn't heard before. You know what I saw today when you watched me with Dakota? She didn't wait for his answer. I saw a man who cared more about my safety than his own embarrassment. Most men would have tried to stop me. They would have insisted on handling it themselves, puffed up with pride, even if it meant they got hurt in the process. They would have seen it as a challenge to their manhood. Emmett felt something tight and knotted loosen in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was relief or something far more complicated. And what I should have written, Willa continued, her voice dropping lower, is that I can't read or write. The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. Emmett stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. Can't read? Can't write? Then, the letters. The letters, he breathed, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening lurch. The beautiful handwriting, the poetic words. Weren't mine, she finished for him, her gaze unwavering. I paid Fletcher Knox a few coins to write them for me. I told him what I wanted to say. The feelings, the loneliness. But the words, the script. That was all him. Emmett's world tilted on its axis. The entire foundation of their connection, the months of correspondence that had made him believe he'd found his soulmate, was a lie. A fabrication penned by the town merchant. Why? He asked, the single word full of hurt and confusion. Because I'm tired of being seen as a curiosity, or a challenge, she said, her voice laced with a bitter, ancient pain. I've spent my whole life having people make assumptions. They see my size, and they think I must be looking for someone to prove their strength against mine. They think I'm simple. They think I'm nothing more than muscle. She took a deep, shuddering breath. I wanted someone to see the person inside. The person I told Fletcher to write about. I just didn't know how to do it myself. The revelation shifted something fundamental in how Emmett saw their entire situation. All day, he had been obsessing over what he lacked, over how he didn't measure up to some imaginary standard of masculinity. But Willa's words, her shocking confession, revealed that she had her own heavy burdens to carry, her own secret inadequacies, her own desperate reasons for seeking a life away from the harsh judgments of others. And it made him realize that Fletcher Knox, the nervous town merchant, wasn't just an awkward bystander. He was a conspirator. He was a keeper of secrets. And Emmett had a sudden, chilling feeling that Willa's illiteracy wasn't the only secret he was keeping. So, what do we do now? He asked, a genuine, burning curiosity replacing the anxiety that had plagued him all day. Willa reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It looked worn, the creases soft from repeated handling. Do you remember what you wrote in your third letter? She asked, unfolding it carefully in the dim porch light. Emmett watched, his heart pounding. It was one of his letters to her. She had kept it. You said, she began, her voice soft as she read the words that Fletcher Knox must have read to her countless times, that you believed real partnership meant two people making each other stronger, not one person making the other feel smaller. Emmett remembered writing those words. They had seemed almost foolishly idealistic at the time, penned by lamplight in the depths of his loneliness. He had worried that such a sentiment might drive away potential respondents, who might be expecting more traditional, clear-cut arrangements. Now, hearing them spoken back to him, they sounded like a promise. A promise he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. "I meant it when I wrote it," he said slowly, his voice hoarse. "But I'm not sure I understood what it would look like in practice." He gestured vaguely toward the new fence they had repaired together, where her raw competence had been so starkly evident next to his own fumbling efforts. "Today made me realize how much I don't know about my own land, my own animals." "And your words," she said, refolding the letter and tucking it carefully away, "made me realize that maybe there was one man in the world who understood that strength wasn't just about the size of your arms, that maybe there was a man who wouldn't be afraid of me." As she tucked the letter away, another piece of paper briefly slipped out of her pocket. It was a wanted poster. Emmett only caught a glimpse of it in the fading light, but he saw enough. He saw a rough sketch of a woman's face, a face that looked hauntingly like Willa's, and a name that was not Willa Blaine. Below it, he saw the words "reward" and "dangerous." She quickly stuffed it back in, her movements sharp and sudden, but it was too late. He had seen it. The woman sitting on his porch wasn't just illiterate. She was a fugitive. Emmett's mind was a whirlwind, a wanted poster, a different name, dangerous. The pieces didn't fit. They crashed against each other, creating a terrifying picture he didn't understand. Who was this woman? What had she done? He looked at her, sitting there in the twilight, looking so weary and vulnerable, and he couldn't reconcile that image with the word dangerous. "In my last letter," Willa continued, seemingly unaware of what he had seen, her voice regaining some of its strength, "I told you I was tired of being alone. But I didn't just mean physically alone. I meant being alone with my thoughts, my struggles, my dreams for what life could be like if I found the right person to share it with." She paused, studying his face in the gathering darkness, and he tried to keep his expression neutral, to hide the storm of questions raging inside him. "I think maybe we both advertised for someone to rescue us from loneliness," she said. "But what we might actually need is someone to be lonely with sometimes, and strong with other times." The distinction she was drawing felt profound, but it was clouded by the dark secret he had just glimpsed. Traditional marriage arrangements in their community were simple. The man provided, the woman nurtured. What Willa was suggesting, what their situation was becoming, was infinitely more complex, more perilous, and yet, somehow, more honest. "So, we try," he heard himself say, the words coming out before he had even fully processed the decision. "We try to figure out what partnership looks like when it doesn't fit any of the usual patterns." It wasn't a question, but Willa nodded anyway. Her expression was serious, but a flicker of warmth, of relief, lit her eyes. "But first," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips as she stood and brushed the dust from her skirt, "you're going to show me how you plan to propose, because technically, we're still just two strangers who happen to be sharing a porch." Her tone was light, teasing, but there was an undercurrent to it. Something in her eyes suggested that the formality, the ritual of it, mattered deeply to her. Perhaps more than she was letting on. Emmett's pulse quickened. She was right. In all the chaos and confusion, the shocks and revelations, they had never actually addressed the fundamental question of whether they still wanted to proceed with the marriage. Could he? Knowing what he now suspected. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his vest pocket. He withdrew the small wooden box he had been carrying since dawn. Inside lay the ring. He had carved it from a piece of oak that had fallen during last winter's storms, its surface polished to a smooth, warm glow by hours and hours of careful, hopeful work. It was simple, unadorned, nothing like the flashy gold bands that wealthier men could afford. But he had poured 3 months of desperate hope into its creation. "I had planned to do this properly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To wait until after we had talked. Until I was sure you weren't disappointed by—" He gestured vaguely at himself, at the modest ranch, at everything that wasn't what she might have been led to expect by Fletcher Knox's eloquent lies. Willa stepped closer. She was close enough now that he could smell the honest scent of hay and hard work on her clothes. He could see the genuine curiosity in her eyes as she looked down at the ring. "May I?" she asked, extending her large, capable hand toward the box. When he nodded, she lifted the ring carefully. She turned it over and over in the moonlight, examining the grain of the wood, the smooth finish he had so painstakingly achieved. "You made this yourself," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice held a note of something that sounded like wonder. "How long did it take?" As she spoke, she tried to slip the ring onto her finger to test the fit. It was too small, just as Emmett had feared it would be. It stopped abruptly at her second knuckle, unable to go any further. 3 months, Emmett admitted, his heart sinking like a stone. He felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over him. The failure of something so basic, so fundamental, felt like a perfect metaphor for everything that had gone wrong since her arrival. He had imagined her hands as delicate and small. He had carved the ring to match his fantasy, not the reality of the woman standing before him. But instead of the disappointment he expected, Willa's face showed something entirely different. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her features and transformed her face completely. 3 months, she repeated softly, her voice filled with awe. "You spent 3 months making something for a woman you had never met, based on nothing but letters and hope." She looked down at the ring, still perched uselessly on her knuckle. "Do you know what that tells me about who you are, Emmett Sloan?" Emmett shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. The evening had already contained more raw emotional honesty than he typically experienced in an entire month, and he felt wrung out, exhausted by the intensity of it all. "It tells me you're someone who believes in taking care with important things," Willa said, her eyes meeting his. "Someone who puts thought and real effort into making something beautiful, even when no one is watching to judge your work." She slipped the ring off her finger and held it up in the space between them, a tiny, perfect symbol of his flawed expectations. "And," she added, her smile widening slightly, "it tells me you're someone practical enough to know that rings can be resized." She paused, and her expression grew serious. "But character cannot." The simple, profound statement hit Emmett with the force of a physical blow. All day he had been obsessed with physical inadequacies, his size, her size, with measurements and comparisons that seemed to matter so much to everyone around them. But Willa was suggesting that there were other ways to measure a person's worth, other kinds of strength that might matter more in the long, hard marathon of a life lived together. He had to know. He had to take the risk. "So, is that a yes?" he asked, the question coming out more uncertain, more fragile than he had intended. Willa's answer came not in words, but in a simple, gentle action. She took Emmett's hands in her own larger ones. She placed the small wooden ring back in his palm and then carefully guided his hands to close around it. "Ask me properly," she said, her voice now a gentle but firm command. "Not because you think you should, or because we made an arrangement through letters written by another man. Ask me because you want to." Emmett looked up into her face, and it felt like he was truly seeing her for the first time since she had stepped off Fletcher Knox's wagon. Yes, she was taller and stronger than he had ever imagined, but there was also a deep, abiding kindness in her eyes that had never come through in their ghost-written correspondence. There was a sharp intelligence there, and a surprising humor, and something that looked suspiciously like affection, despite their brief, chaotic acquaintance. And despite the wanted poster. Despite the danger. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine and dusty earth filling his lungs. "Willa Blaine," he said, his voice growing steadier and stronger with each word. "Or whoever you are. Will you marry me? Not because of letters or arrangements or what other people expect, but because I think we might be able to build something good together. Something real. Something neither of us could ever build alone." "Yes," she said simply, the single word hanging in the cool evening air between them like a promise. "Yes, I will." The relief that flooded through Emmett was so intense, so overwhelming, it almost made him lightheaded. "But," she added, her expression turning serious again, "I have conditions." Emmett's stomach tightened instantly. He braced himself. "First," she said, "I want us to resize this ring together. I want to learn how to work with wood. I want you to teach me." She took a breath. "And second, I want you to let me teach you. About cattle and horses and mending fences with more than just hope. I want you to let me show you all the things I know that might be useful here." Her conditions weren't demands for him to change who he was. They were invitations to share knowledge, to share skills, to build a life as true partners. "I'd like that," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "All of it." As he smiled, he realized something. He had made his choice. He had seen the wanted poster. He knew she was in trouble, that her name was a lie. But in that moment, none of it mattered more than the truth he saw in her eyes. He was choosing to trust the woman on his porch, not the fears her secrets created. But as they stood there, a fragile new understanding forming between them, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard toward the ranch. He was moving too fast for a friendly visit. He was riding like a man who was hunting someone down. The lone rider thundered into the yard, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He was a broad, grim-faced man with cold, assessing eyes and a pistol strapped low on his hip. He pulled his horse to a sharp halt, kicking up a cloud of dust, and his gaze swept over the ranch before landing on Willa. A flicker of recognition, and something that looked like triumph, crossed his face. "So this is where you ran to, Elspeth," he said, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. Emmett's blood ran cold. Elspeth, not Willa. He looked at the woman beside him. Her face had gone pale, her body rigid. The warmth and softness from moments before had vanished, replaced by a hardened, defiant mask. "My name is Willa," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Emmett could feel running through her. The man let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You can call yourself whatever you like. Your father sent me. The name's Jedediah Kane. He wants you back. And the horse you stole." "The horse was my mother's," she shot back, her chin held high. "And I'm not going back, not ever." "That's not your decision to make," Kane sneered. His eyes shifted to Emmett, dismissing him with a contemptuous glance. "And who's this? The little man you found to hide behind?" Emmett felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly swamped by fear. This man, Kane, radiated a casual brutality. He was a predator who had found his prey. "She's my fiancée," Emmett said, stepping forward slightly, trying to place himself between Kane and Willa. It was a pathetic gesture, he knew. The man could swat him away like a fly. But he had to do something. Kane laughed again, louder this time. "Fiancé? Your father will have a good laugh about that before he takes a strap to you for the trouble you've caused." He swung his leg over his saddle, dismounting with a heavy thud of his boots. We're leaving, now. Don't make this difficult, Elspeth. I told you. No, Willa said, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She took a step back, her eyes darting around, looking for an escape that wasn't there. I wasn't asking. Kane took a step toward her, his hand moving casually toward the butt of his pistol. I was sent to fetch you, one way or another. Suddenly, a voice boomed from across the yard. Is there a problem here? It was Samuel Morrison. He was walking toward them, his 3 large sons fanning out behind him like a pack of wolves. Morrison held a shotgun, cradled loosely in his arms, and his sons carried heavy farm tools that could easily serve as weapons. Emmett's heart sank even further. This wasn't a rescue. This was an escalation. Morrison must have been watching, waiting for his moment. Kane eyed Morrison and his sons, his expression turning from confident to wary. He was outnumbered. This is a private family matter, he growled. Doesn't look private to me, Morrison said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He wasn't looking at Kane. He was looking at Willa. Looks to me like this lady is being harassed on property that borders my own, and we don't take kindly to that around here. Emmett realized with a sickening jolt what was happening. Morrison wasn't helping them. He was seizing an opportunity. He was positioning himself as the protector, the strong man who could handle the threat that Emmett clearly couldn't. He was trying to win Willa, to claim her, by demonstrating his own power. The situation was a powder keg. Kane, the brutal enforcer from Willa's past, Morrison, the opportunistic local tyrant, and Emmett and Willa trapped in the middle. Her name is Elspeth Blaine, Kane said, deciding to use the truth as a weapon. She's a runaway, stole a horse and fled her family. There's a reward for her return. Morrison's eyes lit up with greedy interest. A reward, you say? His gaze on Willa became even more proprietary, like she was a prize to be won. She is my fiancée, Emmett repeated, his voice shaking but loud, and she is staying here, on her own land. Kane and Morrison both ignored him completely. They were 2 alpha predators sizing each other up, with Willa as the prize. She's coming with me, Kane stated flatly. I don't think so, Morrison countered, lifting the barrel of his shotgun just a few inches. I think she's staying right here under my protection. Willa, Elspeth, looked between the 2 men, her face a mask of trapped despair. She had run from one cage, only to find herself caught between 2 more. Emmett knew he had to do something. Brute force was useless. He couldn't fight Kane or Morrison's clan. He had to think. What did he have that they didn't? His mind raced. The letters, the land deed, the law. While Kane and Morrison were locked in a standoff of testosterone and threats, Emmett's mind was working frantically, connecting dots that no one else could see. He thought of Fletcher Knox, the nervous merchant who knew Willa's secrets. He thought of the town sheriff, a man who disliked Morrison but was generally too timid to cross him. He needed leverage, something undeniable. He looked at Willa, a desperate plan forming in his mind. He needed a distraction. Dakota, he whispered to her, his voice so low that only she could hear. The signal you used. Can you do it again? Can you call him? Willa's eyes widened in understanding. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Emmett turned to face the 2 armed groups. This is my property, he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that surprised even himself. And you are both trespassing. I want you to leave. Now. Kane and Morrison both turned to him with expressions of pure disbelief, as if a mouse had just roared at them. You're in no position to make demands, Sloane, Morrison sneered. That's where you're wrong, Emmett said. At that moment, Willa put 2 fingers to her mouth and let out a sharp, piercing whistle. It was a sound that cut through the tense silence like a knife. For a moment, nothing happened. Kane and Morrison exchanged amused glances. Then a deep, rumbling roar echoed from the barn. The reinforced doors shuddered. Then they exploded outwards, splinters of wood flying through the air. Dakota, the 2,000-pound bull, charged out into the yard. His head was low, his eyes were red, and a plume of dust and steam snorted from his nostrils. He wasn't the calm, docile animal Willa had led from the garden. He was a raging storm of muscle and fury, and he was charging directly at the group of men. Morrison's sons yelled in terror and scattered, dropping their tools and scrambling for safety. Morrison himself fumbled with his shotgun, his face ashen. But the bull wasn't aiming for them. He was aiming for Jedediah Kane. Kane, caught completely by surprise, barely had time to draw his pistol. He fired a single shot that went wide, whining off into the sky. Then the bull was on him. Dakota didn't gore him with his horns. Instead, with a powerful sweep of his massive head, he slammed into Kane's side, sending the man flying through the air. Kane landed in a crumpled heap near the water trough, groaning, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The bull skidded to a halt, snorting and pawing the ground, placing himself protectively between Willa and the fallen man. In the stunned chaos that followed, Emmett moved. "Willa, keep him calm," he ordered, and then he ran. Not away from the danger, but toward town. He had his leverage now. An armed bounty hunter, a broken leg, an illegal assault on his property, and a very angry bull as his star witness. Morrison, seeing his moment of dominance shattered, and now facing a furious bull and a potential legal nightmare, hesitated. His sons were already retreating. His power play had backfired spectacularly. Emmett ran faster than he ever had in his life, his mind clear and focused. He wasn't the small, weak man anymore. He was a man with a plan. He was going to get the sheriff. He was going to get Fletcher Knox. And he was going to end this, once and for all. He was going to prove that the sharpest weapon on the frontier wasn't a gun or a fist or the size of a man. It was his mind. Emmett burst into the sheriff's office, gasping for breath, his words tumbling out in a frantic but coherent stream. He told Sheriff Miller everything: the bounty hunter Jedediah Kane, the false name, the armed threats from Samuel Morrison, the assault on his property. He was careful to frame it perfectly. This wasn't a domestic squabble. It was an invasion by an armed outsider and an illegal power grab by a local bully. For once, Sheriff Miller, a man who usually avoided conflict, saw a clear-cut case. An out-of-town gunman attacking a citizen was something he had to act on. The fact that it also gave him a legitimate reason to put the arrogant Samuel Morrison in his place was just a bonus. They deputized 2 men from the general store and headed back to the ranch, but not before Emmett made one more stop. He found Fletcher Knox hiding behind a barrel of pickles, looking terrified. "Fletcher," Emmett said, his voice hard, "you're coming with me. You're going to tell the sheriff everything you know about Jedediah Kane and the Blaine family. You're going to tell him how you helped Willa escape. You are going to be a witness." Knox, seeing the sheriff and 2 armed men behind Emmett, and realizing the secret was out, capitulated immediately. The truth was his only path out of trouble now. When the posse arrived back at the ranch, the scene was a tense stalemate. Kane was still on the ground, his leg clearly broken, writhing in pain. Morrison and his sons stood at a safe distance, unsure of what to do next, and Willa stood calmly by Dakota's side, her hand resting on his massive neck, the bull still acting as her loyal, rumbling guardian. "Samuel Morrison," the sheriff bellowed, "you and your boys drop those weapons. You're being detained for menacing and armed trespass." Morrison, seeing the law had turned against him, reluctantly complied. His face was a thunderous mask of fury and humiliation. He had gambled for power and lost everything. Next, the sheriff turned to Kane. "And you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." He nodded to his deputies. "Get him patched up, then lock him up. We'll send a wire to the marshal about this Blaine family of yours. See if they're known for sending hired guns after their own daughter." As the deputies hauled Kane away, Fletcher Knox stepped forward, his voice trembling as he told his story. He explained how Willa, Elspeth, had come to him, desperate to escape a brutal, controlling father who was trying to marry her off to a cruel man for a land deal. He confessed to writing the letters, to helping her create a new identity, to giving her a chance at a life of her own. He painted a picture of a terrified young woman running for her life, not a dangerous criminal. The story, combined with Kane's violent actions, completely changed the narrative. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the drama unfold now looked at Willa not with suspicion or amusement, but with a newfound sympathy and respect. She wasn't an oddity, she was a survivor. Later that evening, after the dust had literally and figuratively settled, Emmett and Willa stood on the porch once more. The broken barn door and the lingering scent of gunpowder were the only reminders of the chaos. "Elspeth," Emmett said softly, testing the name. "I like Willa better," she replied, a small, tired smile on her face. "Willa is who I chose to be. Elspeth is who I was forced to be." "Willa, then," he said, nodding. He reached into his pocket and took out the small, unfinished wooden ring. He held it out to her. "You said you had conditions, that you wanted to resize this together." She took the ring from his hand. "And I want to teach you how to handle a bull without needing him to charge someone." He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like a release of all the tension and fear he'd been holding inside. "And I'll teach you how to read. We can start with the words in my letters, the ones that were true, even if the handwriting wasn't yours." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. In her gaze, he didn't see a giant or a fugitive or a problem. He saw his partner. He saw a woman whose strength was not just in her arms, but in her spirit. A woman who had fought for her freedom and chosen him to share it with. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she saw him too. Not as a small man or a weak man, but as the man who had run toward town instead of away from the fight. The man who had used his wits to protect her when muscle would have failed. 6 months later, as autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Emmett and Willa stood before the justice of the peace. The wooden ring, now perfectly sized, sat snugly on her finger. A matching band, which she had carved for him under his tutelage, was on his. The ranch was prospering. Their partnership, forged in chaos and truth, was a thing of local legend. Emmett's careful planning, paired with Willa's physical prowess and incredible animal expertise, had transformed the modest homestead into one of the most productive in the area. The whispers and speculation from their neighbors had long since been replaced by respect and even a touch of envy. They were a team, balanced and effective. They showed everyone that strength came in many forms, and that a true partnership wasn't about fitting into old roles, but about creating new ones together. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought them together was all but forgotten, replaced by something far more real and infinitely more valuable. A partnership built not on idealized letters or false expectations, but on mutual respect, shared struggle, and the kind of unshakable love that grows from truly seeing and accepting another person for exactly who they are. They had both been searching for a rescue from loneliness, but what they found was something better. They found a partner to build a life with, a fortress against the world, proving that the strongest bonds are forged in the most unexpected fires. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more unforgettable tales from the wild frontier. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. And let us know in the comments. What do you think is the true meaning of strength? Thanks for watching.